Hello, and welcome to another episode of Weekly Spark. I'm doing this in a couple different stages. The first stage is I want to collage down just really simple papers in some neutral colors and some text so that I can work on a surface that is not completely white. I will probably leave some white of the page showing because I'm going to be stenciling over top of it with a couple different things. I'm going to be stenciling some stencils with gloss gel, and that's going to act like a resist. So for example, this text would show through, and then I can paint over that once it's dry. I'm also going to be making a mixture of modeling paste and white gesso, because that's going to give me a really thick textural, dimensional material that I can stencil with, but the white gesso is going to make it opaque. And so that'll be something that I can lay down patterns that will not be transparent like the gloss gel. And then when that dries, can paint around it as well. So I want to have different materials that the paint can kind of sink into the page after I've stenciled on it. So like I said, I don't want to cover the whole white of the page because wherever I collage down, it's going to have some matte gel on it because that's what I'm collaging things down with. You see what I'm saying? So I'm going to cover parts, but not all, in a random way. So stage one, collage. This color palette with the newspaper and the brown paper is very much taking me back to art history and making me bring to mind some of the early collage work of Picasso and Juan Gris. Probably pronounced that wrong. And the irreverence of their using such everyday materials in their collages. It's definitely an experiment to see how the stenciling is going to go on this crumpled tissue, since I think that's going to give me less of a perfect stencil pattern where it's textural. So that'll be fun to play with. Some of this white tissue was stained with something. So. All right, there's very little of the original paper left. While you can see white of the page, I mean that there's only a strip here that does not have a matte medium on it. Whoops, I was thinking I would probably have a little more plain paper showing, but I was having fun collaging. So this is part one. I'm going to let this dry, and then I'll come back in with my stencils and my mixtures. Okay, my collage layer is 95% dry, so dry enough that I'm going to go for it. And the first thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to use a palette knife for this one. I'm going to do this border stencil. This is from Stencil Girl. It is a Laurie Mica design, and I'm using just straight up gloss gel. pulled that all the way through, scraped off the excess, and then I want to just lift this straight up so that I leave those nice thick spots. Now I can already see that I have some smearing and some gloopiness here in this area. So I'm just going to roll with that because, you know, I'm not going to scrape it off and start over. That's not the kind of page I'm doing. So the next thing that I want to do, I'm actually going to use this large mandala stencil because you know how much I love them kind of positioned in the corner. Let me leave that sitting while I mix up my stuff. I'm going to use about half and half modeling paste, which is clear, and gesso, which is opaque white. So that combo is going to give me the thick body of the modeling paste. Sorry, there's lots of arm waving. Modeling paste, you can see, is real thick. It's like peanut butter. I've probably pulled out more than I'm going to need. Once you start mixing, they look a lot alike, and so it's hard to tell when things are mixed well.
Maybe I didn't mix it too much.
Now this is when I do clean my stencils. Because this stuff is so thick and textural, I don't want that to dry and clog up the stencil shapes itself. Again, add a little pulling where there was some tissue paper, had a little seepage under here, but I don't know if I can zoom in here and show you can see some of the shadow on the thickness of that. So that's kind of cool. This spot was unnecessary. We'll just remove that. So I know I've said that I often leave my stencils dirty. And I do clean them when I'm using this modeling paste. Mary Beth Shaw of Stencil Girl Products has an excellent tip that if you want to keep your stencils clean, you can have like a tray, like, you know, an aluminum foil tray on your table filled with water and maybe a little, I think she said Murphy's oil soap. And so you can drop your stencils in after you use them. By the time you finish that art journaling session, they're probably going to be clean. So if keeping them clean is a concern, that would be her recommendation. I'm telling you, her stencils are fabulous, and her YouTube channel and her website are an excellent resource. So we've got the plain clear, we've got the half and half. Let's do a little spot that is just the modeling paste straight up, because then we'll have that to compare and see how clear or transparent it is when it is on the page. So this will just be straight out of the jar. I think for right now, I'm going to leave that. It definitely has a real dead space in the center, doesn't really have a focal point. So there's going to be a lot to play with when I'm actually, finishing this page. But for this first part, that gives me enough to work with, and it is thick, so I do have to give it plenty of time to let it dry. Sometimes I use a heat gun for drying things, but I don't like to use it for the thick things. I don't want the acrylic to bubble up or to get weird in any way. So stay tuned. If I haven't mentioned already, then please click the subscribe button, give it a thumbs up, like the channel, because I do release new content on Wednesdays for art journaling on this weekly Spark kind of playlist. So we'll be back in a few to finish this off. Well, let's see now. It's been a couple of days, actually probably over a week, and this technically was going to be one of the May videos, talking about stenciling this thick paste stuff, and then, life happened. So even though it's June, I wanted to finish this one up, part 2, obviously, and get some color over this and see how it reacts down in the depth of the textures created by the stencils, see how it reacts over the gel medium versus the plain page. So I have watercolors, I have a couple different acrylic inks, and I have some acrylic paint. I also have some of these water-soluble crayons by Kingart. So my color palette is kind of turquoise, yellow ochre, maybe a little like muted purple. Those are just what I pulled. So we'll see how that goes. I want to start off here in this bottom corner with some watercolor because the Daniel Smith Moon Glow is a delicious kind of moody, dark purple. And it breaks and granulates really nicely when it's on plain paper. So I don't know what effects it might have here. And I'll just thin that out with a little water so we don't have such a hard edge. I'm going to leave that untouched and see how it dries on top of the thick gel medium. The nice thing here is that when you lay it on kind of heavy and intense like that, it's going to naturally gravity puddle in the depth of the texture stencil. So we've got that really dark, more intense color happening. So I kind of love that. Acrylic ink. I always put the lid back on after I put some in a palette just because, if I spill that, that's going to be everywhere. I'd forgotten I stenciled there. That's a fun reveal. I don't want to go over all of the gel medium stencil because that definitely does act differently with the Kingart. So, this kind of thing is exactly what I love, that it's puddling and you get this lighter on the stencil. If, sometimes you can blot it. Now that took off too much. So let's go back in and just repeat what we had done. Because the gel medium works like resist, we get some of the clean paper showing through. If you wanted to go in and, take a Q-tip or some fine tip, you could clear up some of the ink that's on top of that stencil pattern, on top of that gel medium. So down here where I know there is more stencil, more clear stencil, gel medium stencil. Yep, just scribbling that on. Because then I'm going to go in with water on my fingertip. So here where the texture is higher, I can kind of just skim the surface and clean some of that off. So I've done other videos with the stenciling and the Kingart, so I'll link those in the comments below so you can see a different, slightly more legible pattern done that way. So acrylic paint, that is. When you have more porous paper underneath, the color is really going to take, and then you can kind of clean off the surface a little bit better. Let's see what else. Let's try this other ink, this muted violet. I don't really have any plans for this page other than experimenting with this stuff. I like that color. Once again, you see why I use cheap brushes, because I am a nightmare on brushes. Just going in and bringing that up a little bit, being precise and letting the contours of the stencil make sure that I was getting things in the right places. I do think I want to darken more behind this stencil. Wrinkly paper here, so that's why there's not so much clarity in that mandala stencil. I love how the watercolor is hitting the wrinkles on that paper differently, so that's going to dry and give me that color intensity where it's pooled. I like the text that's coming through in different layers with that clear gel medium. So yeah, this is nothing fancy. This is by no means like a finished perfect page, but it was a good chance to experiment with some things with different stencil textures and then ways to kind of bring that up. I really like the watercolor. Now, this tape has been on here for quite a while, and I was stenciled over it. So I'm going to tear it off and we're going to hope for the best. It may not come off cleanly. See, it's starting to take the paper up with it. If this were a page that I was more serious about, I could use the heat gun, and that would just help loosen up the adhesive in the tape a little bit. But I'm pleasantly surprised at how easily it's coming up where I did stencil onto the tape. I thought that would be a bigger problem, and it is lifting up. Like that was perfect. This might be a fun background page to like stencil something or draw something really simple on top of, like one of my goddess figures, just in like, black or white with this colorful background. So I may turn this into something yet, but we'll see. I mean, I was just playing and experimenting and trying to show you some uses of stencils when you are using either the gel medium or the thicker modeling paste. So I hope that sparks some ideas. I'm going to let it dry and sit with it for a while and see if it sparks any ideas for me. Stay tuned over the next couple of weeks, because as June starts, I'm going to be doing a different theme for June, and I'm going to be carving some stamps. I have some stamps that I've carved at different times to use as different patterns in my journaling. And so I'm going to be doing this as the focus of June, both carving them and some just freeform and some organized patterns, some that, are a thing. Good crescent moon stamp is a nice thing to have, and others that are designs. So stay tuned in June for some stamp carving and ways that I'm going to put that into some of my art journal pages. As always, click the like button, subscribe to the channel. These things help everything out a lot, and I look forward to seeing you for another episode of Weekly Spark next week.